The world has a cruel way of measuring a man's worth. We are taught from a young age that the fabric of our clothes, the weight of the watch on our wrist, and the shine of the car we drive are the only true indicators of value. We live in a society that worships the golden calf of appearance, often forgetting that the brightest wrappers often hide the most hollow gifts, while the most battered chests contain the purest gold. This is a lesson that Richard Sterling had never learned. Or perhaps it was a lesson he had actively chosen to unlearn on his climb to the top. Richard was a man who didn't just walk into a room. He announced himself with the heavy, confident stride of someone who owns the very air others breathe. At 45, he was the picture of modern success, a titan of real estate, a shark in the boardroom, and a man whose heart had slowly turned into a calculator, weighing every human interaction by what he could gain from it. On this particular Tuesday morning, the sky over the city was a piercing, cloudless blue, the kind of day that feels designed exclusively for winners. Richard adjusted his silk tie in the rearview mirror of his black sedan before stepping out onto the polished pavement. He wasn't just anywhere. He was standing in front of the Obsidian, the city's most exclusive luxury car dealership. This wasn't a place where people came to browse. It was a sanctuary of excess where appointments were mandatory and credit limits were merely a suggestion. Richard was there to collect his trophy, a limited edition sports car that cost more than most people would earn in 3 lifetimes. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors, the cool, conditioned air hit him, carrying the scent of premium leather and expensive cologne. It was the smell of power, and Richard inhaled it greedily. The showroom was silent, a cathedral of chrome and steel. The sales manager, a slick man named Marcus, spotted Richard immediately and practically ran over, his smile tight and practiced. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, the hollow banter of men who only respect the size of each other's bank accounts. Richard felt a surge of adrenaline. This was his kingdom. He ran his hand along the hood of a silver convertible, feeling the cold metal against his palm, imagining the envy on the faces of his colleagues when he pulled up to the office. He was lost in a fantasy of his own greatness, checking his reflection in the window, admiring the sharp cut of his Italian suit. He felt invincible, untouchable, a god among insects. But the universe has a sense of humor, and often, right at the peak of our arrogance, it sends a test. The heavy glass door at the entrance creaked open again. It wasn't the confident swoosh of a wealthy patron. It was a hesitant, slow push. The sudden intrusion of a different kind of energy made Richard turn around, annoyed that his private moment of glory was being interrupted. Standing in the doorway was a figure that seemed to have wandered in from a completely different world. He was an old man, perhaps in his late 70s, stooped over as if carrying the weight of invisible mountains on his shoulders. His coat was a faded, dusty brown, frayed at the cuffs and missing a button. His trousers were baggy and stained with what looked like garden soil, and his shoes, oh, those shoes, were scuffed work boots that had clearly walked miles on rough pavement. He held a crumpled paper bag in one trembling hand and a worn walking stick in the other. The silence in the showroom shifted. It went from the respectful hush of luxury to the awkward, heavy silence of embarrassment. Richard stared at the old man with a look of unmasked disgust. To him, this stranger wasn't a person. He was a stain on a perfect canvas. He was a reminder of weakness, of poverty, of everything Richard had spent his life running away from. The old man blinked, his eyes milky and tired, adjusting to the harsh showroom lights. He took a tentative step forward, his boots squeaking slightly on the pristine marble floor. That tiny sound grated on Richard's nerves like a nail on a chalkboard. Why was nobody doing anything? Why was security not dragging this vagrant out by his collar? Richard looked at Marcus, the manager, expecting him to act. But Marcus seemed frozen, caught between the instinct to protect the showroom's image and a strange hesitation. Richard couldn't stand it. His ego, inflated by the morning's triumph, couldn't handle the proximity of such failure. He stepped away from the silver car, crossing his arms over his chest, his voice booming through the quiet space. "Excuse me," Richard said, his tone dripping with icy sarcasm. "I think you're lost, old man. The soup kitchen is 3 blocks down on the left. This place is for people who actually have business here." The old man stopped. He looked up, and for a second, his eyes met Richard's. There was no anger in them, no fire of defiance, just a deep, oceanic sadness and a patience that seemed ancient. He didn't speak immediately. He simply clutched his paper bag tighter to his chest, as if it contained diamonds instead of a meager lunch. "I am not lost," the old man said, his voice raspy and quiet, barely a whisper in the cavernous room. "I just wanted to look. Is looking a crime now?" Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound that lacked any warmth. "Looking? Do you have any idea where you are? You can't afford the air in this room, let alone the cars. You're scaring the customers. You're making the place smell like despair." He took a step closer, invading the old man's personal space, using his height and presence to intimidate. "Look at you. You're a mess. People like you think you can just wander into places like this and pretend you belong. It's pathetic. Go back to whatever bridge you crawled out from under." The cruelty of the words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. The sales staff looked down, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene against their VIP client. They knew Richard Sterling. They knew his temper and his wallet. The old man, however, didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his weathered face etched with lines that told stories Richard couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Appearances can be deceiving, young man," the old man said softly, a strange dignity rising in his posture. "You see dust on my boots, but you don't know where I have walked. You see a worn coat, but you don't know who it has kept warm." Richard's face turned red. He wasn't used to being answered back, certainly not by someone he considered beneath him. The audacity of this beggar lecturing him on life was too much. He felt a vein throb in his temple. He turned to Marcus, snapping his fingers. "Marcus, are you going to handle this, or do I have to take my business elsewhere? I'm trying to buy a $500,000 car, and you're letting this scarecrow stand here and insult me? Get him out. Now." The ultimatum was thrown. The tension in the room snapped tight. Richard watched with a sneer as Marcus finally moved, straightening his tie and walking toward the old man with an apologetic but firm expression. Richard felt a twisted sense of victory. This was how the world worked. The strong commanded, and the weak were removed. He turned back to the mirror, adjusting his cuffs, unwilling to give the old man the satisfaction of another glance. But he didn't see the small, sad smile that played on the old man's lips. Nor did he notice the way the old man's hand moved into his pocket, not to beg, but to touch something hidden. Richard thought he had won this round, asserting his dominance over a chaotic world. He had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and that the man he was kicking out wasn't a beggar at all. The real lesson was about to begin, and it would cost Richard far more than money. The atmosphere in the showroom had shifted into something brittle and sharp, like glass ready to shatter. Marcus, the manager who usually moved with the oil-slick grace of a man accustomed to handling million-dollar egos, looked torn. He glanced from Richard's furious, red-faced demand to the quiet, stoic figure of the old man standing by the door. It was a moment that stretched for an eternity, a silent battle between the mandate of commerce and the basic instinct of human decency. But in Richard Sterling's world, decency was a currency that had devalued long ago. He tapped his foot impatiently, the sound echoing against the polished tiles, a rhythmic countdown to an explosion. He wanted the visual blight removed. He wanted his perfect morning restored. He watched with a predator's satisfaction as Marcus finally straightened his spine, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the intruder. Richard crossed his arms, leaning back against the fender of the silver convertible, a smirk playing on his lips. He expected a scene. He expected the old man to beg, to cry, to rant about unfairness, or perhaps to ask for a few dollars to make himself disappear. That's what people like that always did, in Richard's experience. They were parasites, always looking for a host. But as Marcus began to speak, his voice low and hushed, the old man didn't protest. He didn't raise his voice or flail his arms. He simply listened, his head tilted slightly to the side, looking at Marcus not with submission, but with a gentle understanding that seemed to unnerve the manager even more than Richard's anger. The old man nodded slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified, contrasting sharply with the chaotic energy Richard was projecting. Then, the old man turned. He didn't look at the exit immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back to Richard. across the expanse of the showroom, their eyes locked for the second time. Richard braced himself for a curse or an insult, something he could laugh off and recount at his dinner party later that evening. But the old man didn't speak. He just looked at Richard with an expression that was terrifyingly unreadable. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was pity. It was a profound, sorrowful pity, the kind one feels for a trapped animal that doesn't realize it's in a cage. That look pierced through Richard's armor of arrogance more effectively than any scream could have. It made his skin crawl. It made him feel small, a sensation he despised above all else. "Get him out!" Richard barked again, his voice cracking slightly, betraying his sudden unease. "Before I call the police and have him dragged out for trespassing." The old man tipped his imaginary hat, since he wasn't wearing one, and turned toward the heavy glass doors. As he pushed them open, the humid city heat rushed in for a brief second, clashing with the sterile air conditioning. "Enjoy your car, Mr. Sterling," the old man said, his voice carrying over the distance with surprising clarity. "May it take you exactly where you need to go." And with that cryptic blessing, which sounded suspiciously like a curse, the old man stepped out onto the sidewalk and vanished into the flow of pedestrians. Swallowed by the city he seemed to blend into so perfectly. With the trash taken out, the showroom seemed to exhale. The tension dissipated, replaced instantly by the frantic, obsequious energy of the sales team trying to salvage the sale. Marcus rushed back to Richard, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead, his smile plastered back on a little too tightly. "I am so sorry about that, Mr. Sterling. Truly. We have security protocols, but sometimes, well, the riffraff just slips in. It won't happen again. We value your patronage above all else." Richard brushed off the apology with a wave of his hand, though the irritation still simmered in his gut. "Just get the paperwork. And make sure this seat is wiped down. I don't want to think about that smell when I'm driving." He spent the next hour signing documents, his signature a sharp, aggressive scrawl on the dotted lines. He bought the car not because he loved it, but to prove a point, to prove that he could. To prove that he was the one who stayed inside the air conditioning while the rest of the world sweated outside. By the time he was handed the keys, heavy, sleek, electronic fobs that felt like power in his palm, he had almost convinced himself that the incident hadn't bothered him. Almost. He slid into the driver's seat, the smell of new leather acting as a drug to his senses. The engine roared to life with a beastly growl that vibrated through the chassis, a mechanical extension of his own dominance. As he drove out of the dealership, the sales staff applauded, a ridiculous, theatrical gesture that he secretly loved. He merged into traffic, weaving between slower cars with aggressive precision. The city blurred past him. He was the king of the road. He turned up the stereo, letting the heavy bass drown out his thoughts. But every time he stopped at a red light, his eyes involuntarily darted to the sidewalk, scanning the faces of the homeless, the elderly, the walkers. He was looking for that brown coat. He was looking for those judging eyes. Why? He didn't know. He told himself he just wanted to yell at the man again, to have the last word he felt he had been denied. Richard wasn't just going for a joyride. He was heading to the most important meeting of his quarter. He was the CEO of Sterling Development, and today they were finalizing a merger with a massive, shadowy investment group known as the Archon Trust. Nobody knew much about Archon, only that they had billions in assets and bought up distressed properties to revitalize them. If Richard landed this partnership, his personal wealth would triple. He would move from being a rich man to being a tycoon. The stakes were astronomical. He checked his watch, a platinum chronograph that cost as much as a small house. He was running perfectly on time. Everything was going according to plan. He pulled into the underground garage of his skyscraper, the tires screeching slightly on the concrete. He threw the keys to the valet without a word, ignoring the young man's greeting, and marched toward the elevator. As he ascended to the 40th floor, he checked his reflection in the mirrored walls of the elevator car. He smoothed his hair, adjusted his tie, and practiced his shark-like smile. "You are a winner," he whispered to himself. "You are the apex predator." The encounter with the old man was just a glitch, a momentary static on the screen of his perfect life. It meant nothing. The elevator doors dinged open, revealing the pristine, minimalist lobby of his company. His assistant, Sarah, was waiting for him, looking pale and nervous. She held a tablet against her chest like a shield. "Mr. Sterling, thank God you're here," she stammered, struggling to keep pace with his long strides toward the boardroom. "The representatives from Archon Trust are already here. They arrived 10 minutes early." Richard stopped dead in his tracks, spinning around to face her. "Early? Nobody arrives early to a meeting with me. I set the time. Who are they?" It's not the usual team, sir," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "They sent the founder, the chairman himself. Nobody knew he was coming. He's never attended a preliminary merger meeting before. He's in the boardroom right now, waiting for you." A cold drop of sweat slid down Richard's back. The chairman of Archon Trust was a ghost story in the business world. No photos, no interviews, just a name that commanded fear and respect. If he was here personally, this wasn't just a meeting, it was a judgment. Richard straightened his jacket, swallowing the sudden lump in his throat. This was it. This was the moment that would define his legacy. He couldn't let a morning of irritation throw him off. He had to be charming, ruthless, and brilliant. He had to be Richard Sterling. "Fine," Richard said, regaining his composure. "Let's go see what the old dinosaur wants. I'll have him eating out of my hand in 5 minutes." He walked to the double mahogany doors of the boardroom. He took a deep breath, put on his most winning, predatory smile, and pushed the doors open. The room was vast, dominated by a long glass table that reflected the city skyline. At the far end of the table, with his back to the door, sat a single figure in a high-backed leather chair, looking out the window at the sprawling metropolis below. The figure seemed small in the massive chair. "Gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice booming with false confidence as he strode into the room. "Apologies for the delay. I was finalizing a purchase that required my personal touch." The chair slowly began to swivel around. Richard continued his approach, hand extended for a handshake, his eyes fixed on the turning chair. "I am Richard Sterling, and it is an honor to finally meet the man behind the myth." The chair completed its turn. Richard froze. His hand stopped in midair. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and the blood drained from his face so fast it left him dizzy. The smile slid off his face like wet paint. Sitting in the chairman's seat was not a man in an Armani suit. It was not a slick corporate raider. Sitting there, with a cup of tea in his hand and a calm, impenetrable expression, was the old man. He was wearing the same dusty brown coat. The same scuffed work boots were resting on the expensive Persian rug. The crumpled paper bag from the dealership was sitting on the glass table next to a stack of billion-dollar contracts. The universe had not just sent a test, it had set a trap, and Richard had walked right into it with his eyes wide open. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavier than the grave, as the old man took a slow sip of his tea and looked up at Richard with those same sad, knowing eyes. "Hello again, Mr. Sterling," the old man whispered. "I believe you mentioned something about a soup kitchen?" The air in the boardroom seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sheer magnitude of the impossibility sitting at the head of the table. Richard Sterling, a man who prided himself on his ability to calculate risks and predict outcomes, found himself standing on the edge of a precipice he hadn't even known existed. His brain stuttered, trying to reboot, trying to find a logical explanation for the hallucination before him. This had to be a prank, a test, a hidden camera show, anything but the reality that was staring him in the face with milky, patient eyes. The silence that stretched between them was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the ghosts of Richard's own insults from an hour ago. They bounced around the room, amplified by the polished glass and the expensive art, sounding even more grotesque in this setting than they had in the car dealership. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He closed it, swallowed dryly, and tried again. The confident baritone that usually commanded rooms was reduced to a strangled squeak. I don't understand," he managed to stammer, his hands trembling by his sides. "You, at the dealership, you are. I am Arthur Pendleton," the old man interrupted softly, his voice calm and steady, contrasting violently with Richard's panic. "Founder and chairman of Archon Trust. And yes, I am also the man you suggested should crawl back under a bridge." Arthur didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply reached into his crumpled paper bag, the crinkling sound echoing like thunder in the quiet room, and pulled out a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He unwrapped it with slow, deliberate movements, placing the humble lunch on the multi-thousand-dollar conference table right next to the merger documents. "Please, sit down, Mr. Sterling. You look like you've seen a ghost. Or perhaps you've just seen yourself clearly for the first time." Richard's legs felt like jelly. He collapsed into the nearest chair, not the one at the head of the table where he usually held court, but a side chair, putting him in a position of submission. He stared at the sandwich, a stark symbol of simplicity amidst the corporate opulence. His mind was racing, rewinding the tape of the morning. Every sneer, every cruel word, every dismissive gesture he had thrown at this man was now a weapon pointed directly at his own throat. He had insulted the one man who held the keys to his future. He had kicked the king out of his own castle. "Mr. Pendleton," Richard began, his voice shaking as he tried to salvage the wreckage of his career. "Sir, you have to understand. It was a misunderstanding. A terrible day. The stress of this merger. I wasn't myself." "If I had known who you were—" Arthur stopped him with a raised hand. It was a gentle gesture, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Stop," Arthur said. "Do not insult me further with lies. You said, 'If I had known who you were.' That is precisely the problem, Richard. You treat people based on who you think they are, based on what they can do for you. If I had been wearing a suit, you would have offered me a coffee. Because I wore a coat that has seen better days, you offered me humiliation. You didn't treat me that way because you were stressed. You treated me that way because that is who you are." The words hit Richard like physical blows. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to use his charm to spin the narrative, but he found himself disarmed. Arthur Pendleton wasn't angry. He was disappointed, which was somehow infinitely worse. The old man took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. "I went to that dealership today for a reason," Arthur continued, brushing a crumb from his lap. "I own that dealership, Richard. I own the building. I own the land it sits on. I like to visit my investments anonymously to see how my staff treats the most vulnerable among us. It's a test. Marcus failed. But you were not being tested. You were merely a customer. And yet, you volunteered to show me the darkness of your heart without any provocation." Richard felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He wiped it away with a shaking hand. "I can apologize," he said, desperate now. "I will apologize to everyone. I'll make a donation, a huge donation to whatever charity you want. We can move past this. The deal, the numbers are solid. Sterling Development is the perfect partner for Archon. You know the figures. You can't let a personal interaction derail a billion-dollar synergy." Arthur sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades of dealing with men like Richard. He reached out and touched the stack of contracts. "The numbers," he mused. "Always the numbers. You think business is about bricks and mortar, about profit margins and quarterly projections. You think you build empires on concrete?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled Richard to the bone. "You are wrong. You build empires on trust, on character, on the way you treat the janitor when no one is looking. I built Archon Trust from nothing, Richard. I started with a toolbox and a dream. I wore boots like these every day for 30 years. And I learned that a man who despises the humble is a man who has no foundation. And a building with no foundation will always collapse." Richard watched in horror as Arthur slowly pushed the stack of merger contracts away from him. The friction of the paper against the glass sounded like a death knell. "I cannot do business with a man who measures worth by the shine of a shoe," Arthur said. "This merger is dead, Richard." "No!" Richard half rose from his chair, panic overtaking decorum. "You can't do that. The board knows about this. The shareholders are expecting it. If this deal falls through, my stock plunges. I could lose everything. You can't destroy my company over a bad mood." Arthur's expression hardened. The grandfatherly softness vanished, replaced by the steel of a titan who had survived wars in the boardroom. "I am not destroying your company, Richard. You did that yourself the moment you decided that human dignity had a price tag. But it is not just the merger. Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his tattered coat. He pulled out not a wallet, but a small black notebook. He opened it to a page filled with handwritten notes. "I did some reading while I was waiting for you," Arthur said, tapping the page. "I looked into Sterling Development's recent evictions. The low-income housing project in the East District? The one you bulldozed last month to make way for luxury condos?" Richard paled. "That was business. It was legal. We gave them notice." "Legal?" Arthur repeated the word with distaste. "Slavery was once legal, Richard. Apartheid was legal. Legal is the refuge of the scoundrel who has no morality. I visited that site too, dressed just like this. I spoke to the families you displaced. I saw the pain you caused for a 12% profit margin." Arthur closed the notebook with a snap. "I have decided that Archon Trust is not just walking away from this deal. We are entering the market, specifically your market." Richard's eyes widened. What does that mean?" "It means," Arthur said, taking another sip of his tea, "that I have resources you can only dream of, and I intend to use them to buy up the debt of your competitors. I intend to underbid you on every project. I intend to offer the tenants you evicted new homes, better homes, at prices you can't compete with. I am going to dismantle your empire, Richard, not with malice, but with the relentless force of a correction. You wanted to play the big man? You wanted to crush the weak? Well, congratulations. You have finally caught the attention of someone bigger than you, and now you are going to learn what it feels like to be the one standing outside in the cold, hoping for mercy." Richard sank back into his chair, the room spinning. This wasn't just a rejected deal. This was a declaration of war, and he was fighting a tank with a plastic knife. He looked at the old man, the scuffed boots, the messy hair, the calm demeanor, and realized with terrifying clarity that he was looking at his executioner. But Arthur wasn't finished. He reached for the phone on the table and pressed a button. "Sarah?" Arthur said into the speakerphone, his voice reverting to that gentle tone. "Could you please come in and bring security? Mr. Sterling is leaving, and I don't believe he will be needing his parking pass anymore." Richard stared at the speakerphone, then back at Arthur. You can't kick me out of my own building." Arthur smiled, a sad, thin smile. "Check your lease, Richard. Your building is owned by a holding company called Obsidian Properties. Guess who owns Obsidian?" The trap snapped shut. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow to the gut. He didn't own the roof over his head. He was a tenant, and his landlord was the man he had called a beggar. As the doors opened and security stepped in, men Richard paid, now looking at Arthur for orders, Richard realized his life as he knew it was over. But the descent was just beginning. Arthur had one more lesson to teach, and it would require stripping Richard of more than just his office. It would require stripping him of his name. The walk from the boardroom to the elevator was the longest journey of Richard Sterling's life. It was a corridor he had walked 1,000 times with the strut of a conqueror, barking orders at trembling interns and ignoring the greetings of the cleaning staff. Today, however, the plush carpet felt like quicksand, dragging at his feet, making every step a monumental effort. 2 security guards, men Richard recognized, men whose names he had never bothered to learn despite seeing them every day for 5 years, flanked him. They didn't touch him, but their presence was a cage more effective than iron bars. They were the physical manifestation of his sudden, violent fall from grace. As he passed the rows of glass-walled cubicles, heads turned. The office grapevine, faster than any fiber-optic cable, had already done its work. The whispers stopped abruptly as he passed, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Hundreds of eyes watched him, not with the usual mix of fear and envy, but with a new, terrible emotion: curiosity. They were watching a car crash in slow motion. They were witnessing the king being stripped of his crown and marched to the guillotine. When the elevator doors pinged open in the lobby, the sound was like a gunshot. Richard stumbled out into the main atrium, the security guards stopping at the threshold, their duty discharged. He was now outside the bubble. He stood on the marble floor, blinking in the harsh sunlight streaming through the revolving doors. He reached into his pocket for his phone, his lifeline, his weapon. He dialed his banker, a man named Charles, whom Richard had made rich over the years. "Charles," Richard hissed into the phone, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and panic. "You won't believe what just happened. I need you to transfer the liquidity from the offshore accounts. I'm going to war with Archon. I need everything liquid, now." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched too long. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was cold, distant, the voice of a stranger. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Richard. We received a federal freeze order on your assets 20 minutes ago. Something about an investigation into irregularities in your zoning permits and potential fraud in the East District evictions. Your accounts are locked, all of them." "Fraud?" Richard screamed, causing people in the lobby to scatter. "There was no fraud. It was business. Who instigated this? It was Pendleton, wasn't it?" "I don't know who initiated it, Richard," Charles said, his tone final. "But the bank is severing ties. We can't be associated with this level of toxicity. Don't call here again." The line went dead. Richard stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the red icon. He tried his lawyer, voicemail. He tried his CFO, voicemail. He tried his friends, the people he drank with, the people he vacationed with. One by one, the calls went unanswered or were abruptly cut short. The rats weren't just leaving the sinking ship. They were the ones who had opened the sea valves. In the span of 45 minutes, Richard Sterling had gone from a man who could move mountains to a man who couldn't even get a hello. He walked out of the building, his legs numb. The valet, the same young man he had ignored earlier, was standing by the curb. But the sleek new car Richard had driven in, the symbol of his arrogance, was gone. In its place stood a tow truck, hooking up the silver convertible. "What are you doing?" Richard roared, rushing forward. "That's my car." "I just bought it." The tow truck driver didn't even look up. "Payment bounced, buddy." Dealership recalled the sale. Said the credit check came back flagged for high risk. "Step back or I call the cops." Richard watched, helpless, as the car was hoisted into the air. It was a metaphor too cruel to be fiction. He was stranded on the sidewalk. He checked his wallet. He had $300 in cash and a stack of platinum credit cards that were now nothing more than useless plastic scrapers. He had nowhere to go. His penthouse? The lease was under the company name. The locks would be changed by nightfall. His beach house? Seized. He was standing in the middle of the city he thought he owned, and he realized with a terrifying jolt that he didn't own anything. He didn't even own the right to be there. As the afternoon wore on, the reality of his situation began to set in with the chilling bite of the evening wind. Richard wandered the streets, dazed. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, replaced by a gnawing, hollow fear. He was hungry. He walked past the high-end restaurants where he usually dined, watching the warm glow of the chandeliers and the happy, wealthy people inside. He saw a reflection of his former self in the window, a man in a suit, laughing, eating, oblivious to the suffering outside. He tried to enter the Gilded Lily, his favorite haunt. The maitre d', a man Richard had tipped thousands of dollars over the years, blocked the doorway with his body. "Not tonight, Mr. Sterling," the man said quietly. "We've been instructed that your membership has been revoked. Please, don't make a scene." Richard turned away, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. He walked until his feet blistered in his expensive Italian shoes. The city transformed as the sun went down. The skyscrapers that usually looked like monuments to ambition now looked like tombstones. The shadows lengthened, and the temperature dropped. Richard found himself in a part of the city he usually only saw from the window of his limousine, the underbelly. The streets here were dirty, the lights flickering. He sat down on a cold concrete bench in a small, overgrown park, clutching his suit jacket tight around him. His stomach growled, a painful reminder of his humanity. He watched people pass by, a young couple arguing over money, a woman pushing a shopping cart filled with cans. And then he saw them, the invisible people, the homeless, the ones he had stepped over, looked through, and despised. They were setting up for the night, claiming patches of dry cardboard, sharing scraps of food. Richard felt a surge of revulsion, but it was quickly drowned out by a wave of envy. They had a community. They had a system. He had nothing. He was an alien on his own planet. A figure approached him from the shadows. Richard tensed, expecting a mugger, but it was a woman, old and frail, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothes. She held out a styrofoam cup of steaming liquid. "You look like you're having a bad day, mister," she said, her voice cracking but kind. "It's just instant soup, but it's warm. Takes the chill off." Richard stared at the cup. His pride screamed at him to slap it away, to scream that he was Richard Sterling, that he didn't drink charity soup from styrofoam cups. But his shaking hands reached out. He took the cup. The warmth seeped through his fingers, the most comforting sensation he had felt all day. He looked up at the woman, ready to ask her why she would help him, a stranger in a suit. But before he could speak, he saw her eyes. They were kind. They were non-judgmental. And in a flash of horrifying recognition, he realized he had seen her before. She was one of the tenants from the East District, one of the people he had evicted. She was living in a park because of him, and yet, here she was, offering him her dinner. The cup shook violently in his hand, spilling hot soup onto his trousers. He couldn't drink it. The guilt rose up in his throat like bile, choking him. He set the cup down on the bench and stood up, backing away. "I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't." He turned and ran. He ran until his lungs burned, ran away from the kindness he didn't deserve, ran away from the monster he realized he was. He collapsed in an alleyway, behind a dumpster, gasping for air. He slid down the brick wall until he hit the dirty ground. He curled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his hands. And for the first time since he was a child, Richard Sterling wept. He didn't cry for his money. He didn't cry for his car. He cried because he was 45 years old, and for the first time, he realized he was completely, utterly alone. He was a pauper in a suit, a king of nothing. And as the cold rain began to fall, mixing with the tears on his face, he knew that this wasn't just rock bottom. This was the beginning of his penance. The night was long, and he had no idea if he would survive to see the dawn. But the real question wasn't whether he would survive. It was whether the man he used to be deserved to. Time lost its meaning in the days that followed. The sharp, segmented hours of a CEO's schedule, meetings, calls, deadlines, dissolved into a gray, fluid blur of survival. Richard Sterling, the man who had once commanded the skyline, had become a ghost, haunting the pavement below. The city he thought he had conquered was now a labyrinth of cold concrete and averted gazes. His Italian suit, once a symbol of his invulnerability, had become a filthy, tattered rag, stiff with grime and smelling of the alleyways where he now slept. The fine wool offered no protection against the biting wind that whipped through the canyons of steel and glass. His expensive leather shoes had cracked, blistering his feet until every step was a fresh agony. He had learned, with a brutal swiftness, that rock bottom was not a place you landed. It was a place that kept getting deeper, stripping away layer after layer of your humanity, until there was nothing left but the animal instinct to breathe and eat. He had tried to cling to his identity at first. He had walked into a bank, shouting his name, demanding access to his funds, only to be escorted out by security guards who looked at him with the same mixture of pity and disgust he had once reserved for Arthur Pendleton. He had tried to sell his watch, the platinum chronograph that cost a fortune. A pawnshop broker in a dim, dusty corner of the city had looked at the timepiece, then at Richard's desperate, hollow eyes, and offered him $50. Richard had screamed, he had cried, he had bargained, but in the end, he took the $50. The money lasted 2 days. He bought food, greasy, cheap fast food that tasted like ambrosia, and he bought a coat from a thrift store. It was a heavy wool thing, smelling of mothballs and another man's life. It was brown. The irony was not lost on him. As he buttoned it up, shivering on a park bench, he looked down at himself and realized he had become the very image he had mocked in the showroom. The universe wasn't just teaching him a lesson. It was rewriting his entire existence to mirror his sins. Hunger was a constant companion now. It wasn't just an appetite. It was a physical pain, a sharp cramp that twisted his insides and clouded his mind. It made him weak, dizzy, and desperate. He found himself looking through trash cans, fighting back the urge to vomit as he salvaged half-eaten sandwiches. He competed with rats for the scraps of the wealthy. The shame that had initially burned in his chest had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard numbness. He was no longer Richard Sterling. He was just a hungry man in a brown coat. It was on a particularly rainy Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after his fall, that he found himself standing on a familiar street corner. He hadn't intended to come here. His feet had dragged him here, guided by a subconscious memory, a phantom echo of a conversation that felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. He looked up and saw the street sign, 3 blocks down, on the left, the directions Arthur had given him. The joke Richard had thrown in the old man's face. The soup kitchen. Richard stood frozen in the rain, the water dripping from the brim of a found baseball cap, soaking into his collar. He couldn't go in there. It was the final surrender. It was the admission that he was truly one of them. But his stomach roared, a violent protest against his pride. He was starving. He hadn't eaten in 30 hours. He took a step, then another, fighting the urge to run away with every inch. As he turned the corner, he saw it. The open door. It wasn't a grim, dark dungeon as he had imagined. It was a warm, brightly lit building with a line of people stretching out the door. He joined the back of the line, keeping his head down, pulling his collar up. He was terrified of being recognized, though he knew it was impossible. The Richard Sterling of the magazines was dead and buried under layers of grime and a thick, unkempt beard. The people around him in line were chatting. They weren't groaning or cursing. They were talking about the weather, about sports, about their families. A man in front of him, missing 2 front teeth and wearing a jacket held together with duct tape, turned around. "Hey, buddy," the man said. "You new here? Don't worry. They got a stew today. Smells like heaven." Richard couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat tight. The man smiled, a genuine, warm smile that didn't ask for anything in return. "I'm Joe," the man said, extending a calloused, dirty hand. Richard stared at the hand. 3 weeks ago, he would have recoiled. He would have called for sanitizer. Now he reached out his own trembling hand and took it. "Richard," he whispered. "I'm Richard." "Nice to meet you, Richard," Joe said. "Line moves fast. You'll be warm in no time." As they shuffled inside, the warmth hit Richard like a physical embrace. The air smelled of rosemary, potatoes, and fresh bread. It was the smell of home. A home Richard realized he never really had, even in his penthouse. The hall was filled with long tables, crowded with people eating, laughing, and sharing stories. Volunteers in red aprons moved between the tables, pouring water, serving bread, treating every person there not as a vagrant, but as a guest of honor. Richard took a tray, his hand shaking so hard the plastic clattered against the metal rail. He moved down the line. "Careful there, darling," a gentle voice said. A woman placed a bowl of steaming stew on his tray, followed by a thick slice of bread. "Take an orange, too. You look like you need the vitamin C." Richard looked up at the volunteer. She was young, smiling, her eyes full of a brightness that hurt to look at. She didn't see a monster. She just saw a man who was hungry. "Thank you," he choked out, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Thank you." He found a spot at the end of a long table, sitting apart from the others, still guarding his shame. He picked up his spoon and took the first bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth. Rich, savory, hot. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Tears, unbidden and uncontrollable, began to stream down his face, dripping into the stew. He ate through the tears, sobbing silently, his shoulders shaking with the release of weeks of pent-up terror and grief. He was eating charity. He was eating the food of the people he had despised, and it was saving his life. As he scraped the bottom of the bowl, he wiped his eyes with his sleeve and looked around the room. He really looked, for the first time. He saw a mother feeding her child, whispering words of encouragement. He saw 2 old men playing chess with missing pieces. He saw humanity in its rawest, most resilient form. He realized with a sudden, piercing clarity that these people were not failures. They were survivors. They possessed a strength he had never known, the strength to keep going when the world had taken everything away. He had broken after 3 weeks. Some of them had been doing this for years. He was the weakest man in the room. Then, the room went quiet. A hush fell over the crowd, not of fear, but of respect. Richard looked up toward the front of the hall. The kitchen doors swung open, and a man walked out carrying a large tray of fresh bread. He was wearing a red apron over a simple flannel shirt and jeans. He moved with a slow, steady gait, smiling at the people, patting shoulders, greeting them by name. Richard stopped breathing. The spoon fell from his hand, clattering onto the table. It was Arthur Pendleton. The billionaire wasn't in a boardroom. He wasn't on a yacht. He was here, serving bread to the homeless on a Tuesday night. He looked tired, older perhaps, but his eyes were alight with a joy that Richard had never seen in the world of high finance. Arthur moved through the tables, sharing words, laughing, offering comfort. He was the servant king. Richard wanted to hide. He wanted to slide under the table and disappear into the floor, but he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the lesson unfolding before him. Arthur worked his way down the room, getting closer and closer to Richard's table. Richard lowered his head, pulling his cap down, praying to remain invisible. He saw Arthur's worn boots stop right next to his chair. "More bread, sir?" Arthur's voice asked, kind and familiar. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. He stared at the boots, the same boots he had insulted in the dealership. "It's fresh from the oven," Arthur said gently. He placed a slice of bread on Richard's tray. He didn't leave immediately. He lingered, his presence a heavy, warm weight. "You know," Arthur said softly, his voice dropping so only Richard could hear, "I once knew a man who thought the world was made of gold. He had to lose the gold to find out what the world was really made of." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. He slowly lifted his head, terrified to meet those eyes. When he did, he didn't find judgment. He found an open door. Arthur wasn't smiling, but his expression was one of profound invitation. He knew. Of course he knew. He had known the moment Richard walked in the door. "Is the stew good?" Arthur asked simply. "Yes," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. It's the best meal I've ever had." "I'm glad," Arthur nodded. "We always need help in the kitchen, Richard. The pots don't scrub themselves. And I think you owe the world a little bit of work, don't you?" Arthur didn't wait for an answer. He patted Richard on the shoulder, a firm, grounding touch, and moved on to the next person. Richard sat there, the fresh bread steaming on his tray, the warmth of Arthur's hand still lingering on his shoulder. The offer hung in the air. It wasn't an offer of money. It wasn't an offer of his old life back. It was an offer of redemption. It was a chance to wash the dishes he had once thought were beneath him. Richard looked at his hands, filthy, shaking, useless hands. Then he looked at the kitchen doors where Arthur had emerged. He took a deep breath, the first breath that felt real in weeks. He stood up. He picked up his tray, and instead of walking to the exit, he turned toward the kitchen. Richard stepped across the threshold and into the heart of the operation, the bustling, clamorous kitchen of the open door. The transition from the polite, sad humiliation of the dining hall to the harsh reality of the industrial kitchen was immediate. The heat was immense, a stifling cloud of steam, boiling water, and the pungent smell of industrial cleaner. He found himself standing amidst mountains of grease-caked pots, pans big enough to bathe in, and stacks of trays piled high with the remnants of the evening meal. He was handed a stiff brush, a pair of thick rubber gloves, and pointed toward the scullery sink, a basin of water hotter than any jacuzzi he had ever owned. Arthur was already at the next sink, sleeves rolled up over his thin forearms, attacking a stockpot with quiet, methodical efficiency. Richard began to scrub. The first pot felt like an anchor. His muscles, long accustomed only to the light exertion of the golf swing and the pressure of a pen, screamed in protest. The grease was thick and sticky, resisting his efforts. His hands, softened by years of luxury, blistered almost immediately beneath the rubber gloves. He wanted to stop. He wanted to rage. He wanted to throw the pot against the wall and demand his old life back. But every time his resolve wavered, he looked up and saw Arthur Pendleton beside him, the man who controlled billions of dollars, scrubbing just as diligently, humming a quiet tune. Arthur didn't lecture or instruct. He simply worked. And in that shared, simple labor, Richard found a strange, unexpected peace. This was honest work. This was effort that translated directly into clean pots for the next person's meal. There was no deception, No quarterly report, no margin for profit, just genuine, humble purpose. Days bled into weeks. Richard stayed. He didn't ask for money or for his life back. He accepted a cot in the shelter across the street and the simple meals served at the kitchen. His expensive suit was replaced by a clean red apron and work clothes donated from a charity bin. The beard he had grown out of shame was now neatly trimmed. His hands were rough, calloused, and strong. He was promoted, not in title, but in responsibility. From pots to prepping vegetables, from sweeping floors to managing the inventory. He laughed more than he had in the last 10 years of his corporate life, finding genuine connection with Joe, the man he met in line, and with the kind volunteer who gave him the orange. He was learning to see people not as assets or liabilities, but as fellow humans, each carrying an invisible burden. The abyss of his loneliness was being slowly, lovingly filled by the camaraderie of the kitchen. One night, months later, after the last dishes were dried and put away, Arthur and Richard sat alone at one of the long wooden tables, sipping weak coffee. The silence was comfortable, earned. "I have to ask, Arthur," Richard said, his voice measured and calm. "Why? Why did you do all of this? The test? The collapse? Why didn't you just destroy me silently?" Arthur smiled, a deep, tired smile that reached his eyes. "Because silent destruction teaches nothing, Richard. I saw a brilliant man enslaved by the wrong metrics. You weren't a millionaire, you were a prisoner. Your wealth was your chain. The arrogance, the contempt, that was the scream of a man trapped in a golden cage. I didn't destroy your company. I liberated you. Your house of cards was built on greed, Richard, and it was going to fall anyway. All I did was remove the foundation quickly, forcing you to find solid ground before you lost your soul completely." Arthur paused, stirring his coffee slowly. "And there was another reason. I knew that the only way for you to truly understand the value of character was to experience the judgment you dealt. You insulted a humble man. You needed to become the humble man to realize that the suit was a disguise and the poverty was a costume. You needed to taste the soup to realize what true abundance is." Richard nodded, tears welling in his eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "The stew was the best meal of my life," he repeated, "because it was served with kindness, not with a price tag." "Exactly," Arthur confirmed. "And that brings us to the real business. Archon Trust is not a typical firm. We are built on restorative justice, not just real estate. We have been quietly acquiring all the properties you wrongfully evicted in the East District. We are building homes for those families, not luxury condos. And we need someone to manage that project. Someone who knows the terrain, knows the development process, but who also knows the value of a warm meal and a kind word." Richard's heart leaped, but he swallowed his initial prideful ambition. "I appreciate the offer, Arthur, but I don't know if I can handle that kind of money or power again. I just want to scrub pots." "That's how I know you're ready," Arthur chuckled. "The man who wants to scrub pots is the only man I trust with my money. The project has no profit margin, Richard. It's about rebuilding community. You will be paid a modest, honest wage. The salary will allow you to rent a small apartment, buy a small truck, and eat something other than stew. But it will be honest wealth, earned through service." Richard stood up, his posture straight, his eyes clear. "I accept, but on one condition. I want to spend every Tuesday night here, scrubbing pots." Arthur rose and extended his hand, not for a corporate shake, but for a handshake between equals. "Welcome home, Richard." The next morning, Richard stood on the curb outside the open door. He wore a simple jacket and carried a backpack containing his few meager belongings. He looked at the city skyline, at the towering fortress that used to be his building. He felt no desire to return. He was no longer running from anything, and he was no longer grasping for anything. He was simply walking toward a small construction site in the East District. He had a small wage, a purpose, and calloused hands. He stopped briefly to look at his reflection in a storefront window. He saw a man who looked older, but whose eyes shone with a new, quiet dignity. He was no longer the arrogant millionaire who despised the humble man. He had learned that the humble man was the one who had nothing to lose and therefore nothing to fear. He had found his true identity not in the balance sheet, but in the bowl of stew. He had lost millions and found his worth. He was now rich in the only currency that truly mattered. And the old man, Arthur Pendleton, who had appeared to be a beggar and turned out to be a king, was the ultimate architect of this redemption. The millionaire despised the humble man, not knowing that the humble man he despised was the only one who could truly save him. His journey had ended, but his life had just begun.